Hi, I'm Dr. David Adams. In the first part of this study, we read Isaiah chapter 51 verses 1 to 3 and saw how God promises to restore his creation. In this part, we'll continue our reading of Isaiah chapter 51 by looking at verses 4 to 6, in which God reveals a different aspect of the results of the work of his servant. So, grab your copy of the Tanakh and let's get started. Verse 4 of chapter 51 begins, like verse 1, with a call to the people of God to pay attention to what God is about to say through his prophet. The words are different, but the point is the same. Hakshivu Eli Ami. The verb that begins this verse, hakshivu, is a Hiphil imperative masculine plural. Its pointing is perfectly standard. The verb kashav is moderately common, occurring just under 50 times in the Tanakh. It means to pay attention to or to listen attentively to. It's the equivalent in the realm of hearing to the visual verb nabat that we had back in verse 2, which means to look closely at something. By choosing these particular words, the prophet emphasizes that the people of God are not called merely to see and hear, but to pay special attention to what God has done. So the earlier call to look closely at what God has done is here paralleled by the call to listen attentively to what God has to say. So we might translate this stitch something like, "Listen closely to me, my people." And the next stitch builds upon this thought as it repeats the call in slightly different words. Ulumi Eli Ha'azinu. The om is a less common word than the am of the previous verse, but it means essentially the same thing, people or nation. Am occurs more than 1,800 times. Laom occurs only 36 times, and always in poetry. Even the 4 instances of its use in the book of Genesis occur in snippets of poetry that are embedded in the prose of the narrative. Outside of the book of Genesis, it occurs in the prophets, in the Psalms, and in Proverbs, but never in the narrative prose of the former prophets, or as we would typically think of them, the historical books. So this is a more poetic term for people or nation. Lumi Eli Hazinu, my nation, to me give ear. Just as Laom stands in parallel with the am of the previous stitch, so also the verb kashav in the previous stitch is paralleled by the verb azan in this one. The form is hiphil. In fact, every occurrence of this verb in the Tanakh is in the hiphil. And like the previous verb, this one is a masculine plural imperative. In poetry, this verb is commonly used in parallel with either shama, to hear, or kashav, to listen closely to, as it is here. Because this is the verb that is related to the noun ozen, ear, we typically render it with the English phrase, give ear to. As in verse 2, the call to pay attention to what God is doing is followed by a clause giving the reason that the people should pay attention to what God is doing. In both cases, the clause is introduced by the particle ki. Here we have ki Torah me iti tetze, because teaching, or Torah, shall go forth from me. The form me'iti is a compound of the preposition min, meaning from, and eighth, meaning with, and a first-person singular suffix. Quite woodenly, we might read, from with me. But this is simply the Hebrew idiomatic way of saying what we would say in English as from me. The verb tetzei is a third feminine singular. Remember, Torah is feminine. From the first yod verb, yatsa, the common verb for to go out or exit. The next stitch continues this thought. Umishpati lo'ami agia. The first part of this clause is straightforward enough. My justice, or perhaps better, my judgment, since the point is that what God regards as right will go forth. Lo'or amim, for a light to the peoples. The problem comes with the verb, and there are two issues here. The first issue is one of poetics. The editors of BHS and some commentators believe that this verb belongs with the next verse, not with this one. So, you see, we have that footnote in the textual apparatus of BHS after the word amim. This is footnote 51-4c that reads hook, H-U-C, Latin for here, TR, which is an abbreviation for the Latin transposit, meaning move, and then the sign of the sof pasuk, the end of verse marker in the Masoretic system of accents. So the footnote tells us that the editors believe that this verse has been misdivided, and the verb should go with the next verse, the next stitch, not with this one. Remember, these verse dividers are part of the Masoretic system of punctuation, and they date from several hundred years after the time of Jesus. So they're definitely not part of the original text of the Bible. Now, if we follow the editors of BHS, we would read this stitch as, my judgment will go forth as a light for the peoples. And frankly, I'm inclined to think that they're right, that the preceding verb tetzei is doing double duty here, and that this verb, ergia, should actually begin the next stitch. But if we did not agree with the editors, and we leave the verse divider where it is, then we have a second problem. What exactly is the meaning of this verb, raga? The Dictionary of Classical Hebrew lists 5 different verbs spelled with these 3 root letters, resh, gimel, ayin. The first means to disturb or stir up, and it has a secondary sense of doing something very quickly, like the blink of an eye. The second, raga, means to rest or to be still or to establish. The third, to harden or break. The fourth means to divide. And the fifth means to flash. They suggest that we take this verb as raga number 5. And so we would read the stitch as, my judgment will flash like a light for the peoples. Now this certainly makes sense, but most others don't see a case for this meaning, since it's not used elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible with that sense. This would be the only place that verb occurs, that raga 5 occurs. So most English translations will take this from what the Dictionary of Classical Hebrew calls raga 2 and read it something like, I will establish my judgment as a light for the peoples. Either way, the point of the verse is clear enough. The ways of God, his Torah and his mishpat, will serve as a light to the people. And this is not just for Israel, as we will see from what follows. But as I said, I'm inclined to read the verb agia with what follows. So I would read the beginning of verse 5 as two stitches, each beginning with a verb. I would read the first, the two of them together, Ergia karov tzidki yatsa yishi. That would translate to something like, I will put, ergia, my righteousness, tzidki, near karov, and then the second stitch, my salvation, yishi, will go forth, yatsa. Or alternately, if we think that the verb raga is being used here in the sense of doing something quickly, we might take this as, I will quickly bring my righteousness near. My salvation goes forth. So while the details may be uncertain, there's really no doubt about the point that's being made here. God is going to act to bring his kingdom to the world. And that point continues in the rest of the verse as well. Uzroi amim yishpatu. My arm, my zoroa, that's a common biblical metaphor for power. Literally, my arm will judge, or perhaps bring about justice for the peoples. Eli is the preposition to, with the first person suffix attached to it, to me. The iyim, this word is the plural of the noun that's simply spelled e, and it's usually translated islands or coastlands. But here's a case where the etymological meaning of the word needs to be supplemented with some understanding based on the cultural background. Remember, Israel mostly lives in the inland hill country of Canaan. They were not a great seafaring people, as the evidence of Jonah makes clear. So anything having to do with the sea often implies something far away and distant and therefore vaguely understood, or in some cases, something hostile or dangerous. So while we might translate iyim as islands, it has a sense that something more like what we would mean when we say the ends of the earth. The verb here is also not common enough that most people have a good sense of its connotation. Yikawu is from the third hey root, kof, wow, hey. It is usually translated something like wait for, but it often implies a sense of longing expectation. So some translations will render this hope for in some contexts. The point here is not just that the distant islands, the ends of the earth, will hang around waiting for God to do his thing. Rather, the point is they long for him. They desire him. They will wait with hopeful expectation for the revelation of God's kingdom. This simple phrase speaks to the desire of all mankind to have that emptiness, that God-shaped hole in their soul, filled with what God himself has for them in the coming of Jesus the Messiah. The last stitch continues the thought. Ve'el zro'i yachlun, and for my arm, that is, for the demonstration of God's power, they will yachal. The verb here is a piel. See the schwa under the preformative and the pathak under the first root letter? That's standard piel. The middle root letter, the cheth, is not doubled in this case because it's a guttural. So the verb is a piel imperfect, third person plural, with a paragogic nun on the end, which doesn't substantially affect the meaning, and it's from the root yachal. This verb is essentially a synonym of chawa that we had in the previous stitch. And like chawa, it means to wait for. And like that verb, this verb also has a connotation of waiting in hopeful expectation. So it too is sometimes translated hope or hope for. So we might render this stitch, and for my arm, or for the demonstration of my power, they hope. So let's put all of verse 5 together. I will hasten to bring my righteousness near. My salvation comes forth. My arm will establish justice for the peoples so that even the distant islands, and here I'd add the word distant to signal the sense of the text for the modern reader. Even the distant islands will wait longingly for me and hope for the demonstration of my power. So God has called his people to listen carefully for the longed-for deliverance that he will reveal, not just for Israel, but to the islands, that is, to the ends of the earth. In other words, for the whole world. And this takes us to verse 6. Verse 6 begins with another call to attend to what God is doing. Te'u l'shamayim enekim. The verb is another masculine plural imperative. This time it's a call form from that very common first nun verb, nasa, meaning to lift up. So lift up to the sky your eyes. The next clause completes the thought. Habitu el haaretz mitachas. Again, here's another in our sequence of masculine plural imperatives. This is the same form that we had in the second clause back in verse 1, and it was repeated at the beginning of verse 2. Habitu, a hiphil from nabat, to look at or pay close attention to. Following the call to lift up our eyes in the first clause, we will continue the visual reference here. Look to the earth below. With these two, we have encompassed the whole world of experience of the ancient hearer, the sky above, the earth below. You say, well, what about the seas? What about under the seas? Well, scuba diving hadn't been invented yet, so the underwater world was not part of the world of their experience. So it's not mentioned. As in verse 2, and again in verse 4, the call to attend to what God is doing is followed by a clause that tells us what we should attend to, what we should see. And just like in those cases, the next clause begins with the particle ki. Ki shamayim ka'eshan nimlachu. For the sky, ka'eshan. This is the preposition kaf, which commonly introduces a comparison, attached to the noun ashan. Ashan is one of those words that refers to a common thing, but a thing that's not mentioned enough in the Bible that most first-year students learn the word. Ashan is one of several words in Biblical Hebrew for smoke. It occurs about 25 times and refers in the common sense to that visible cloud of particulate matter that's given off by something burning. But smoke is also used as a symbol in the Bible. It's used a number of times as a symbol of God's presence, as it is, for example, at Mount Sinai. But here, and in about 5 other places in the Tanakh, smoke is used as a symbol of something else, something transient and impermanent, something that's here for a short time, but soon goes away. Think of Psalm 37, verse 20. The wicked will perish like the smoke. They will pass away. And that's the point of the metaphor here. Understanding the metaphor helps us translate the verb that follows, nimlachu. The form here is simple enough. It's a nifal perfect, third common plural, from the root mem lamed cheth, malach. The verb is related to the word for salt, which is melach. The verb commonly means to be gray or be dark. Now, this may not make so much sense to us because we're used to processed salt, the kind that we use in cooking or as a seasoning, and when we see it today, it's white. You know, there's evidence of the use of salt in the ancient world going back to before 5000 BC. In the biblical world, they got it from evaporation and also got it from mining. And salt was an important trading commodity used for seasoning and as a preservative. In its natural state, salt, or sodium chloride, often appears a kind of shade of off-white or dingy blue-gray. That's because of the impurities that are mixed with it, and those are taken out, of course, today, so that's why it looks always white for us. And that's probably the connection between the word for salt and the word for gray or dark. Here, the metaphor depends not on the color, but on another characteristic of salt. The fact that when you mix salt with water or other liquids, the salt disappears. It's transient. It vanishes. But you know, salt also vanishes in another sense. If it's left exposed to the air for too long, it will absorb moisture from the atmosphere, and then it becomes more dilute, and it loses its flavor. Remember, Jesus uses this aspect of salt in the Beatitudes when in chapter 5 of the Gospel of Matthew he says, "You're the salt of the earth, but if the salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored?" But back to Isaiah. God says through the prophet that the sky will malach, it will evaporate or dissipate or disappear like salt put in water. Although he uses the metaphor smoke, it will disappear like smoke. The next clause continues this metaphor. V'ha'aretz kabeged tivlech. The earth like a beged. Beged is a common Hebrew word. It's used more than 200 times. So this is a word you should know. If you don't know, you should learn it this week. It refers to a generic article of clothing, what we would probably call a garment. So the prophet says, the earth like a garment will tivle. The verb is simply a call imperfect, second feminine singular. The noun for earth is one of those nouns in Hebrew that can be either masculine or feminine, but tends to be feminine most of the time. The verb is from the root beth lamed he, bala, to wear out. So we would read, the earth will be worn out like a garment. Now, I think there's a play on words being employed by Isaiah here. We had that verb malach, to be gray or dissipate, in the previous verse. And I mentioned the related noun melach, meaning salt. But there's another related word to this as well. And it's spelled the same way, melach. And it's used just a couple of times by Jeremiah. And he uses it to refer to a worn out piece of clothing, a rag. And it's tempting to think that here Isaiah may be picking up that double meaning as he constructs this metaphor. And this is something that poets do in most languages. The sky will malach, and the earth will become like a melach. Since it's not explicit in the text, We can't be sure that the prophet has this double meaning in mind, but it's tempting to think so because it helps to explain the way that the metaphor is constructed in the poetry of our text. But the metaphor isn't finished yet. The prophet continues it in the next clause. V'yosheveha kamokain yamuthun. Now, this is a little bit tougher. Yosheveha is a call participle masculine plural with a third feminine singular suffix on the end. Its dwellers, we might say, or its inhabitants, or its residents, or perhaps a little more loosely, those who inhabit it, or those who dwell on it, since we're referring to the earth. The next form, kamokain, is an interesting compound. As it stands in the Masoretic text, it appears to be the preposition kamo, that alternate or longer semi-independent form of the attached preposition kaf, meaning like or as, followed by the adverb kain, meaning thus or so. If you put them together, you have something meaning like thus, or like so, or perhaps in a similar manner. So we would translate this clause, its inhabitants will die in a similar manner. Well, that certainly makes sense in the context of this metaphor of the heavens and the earth coming to an end. And the idea here would be something like the idea that we have in Isaiah chapter 40, verses 6 to 8. All flesh is grass, and all its beauty is like the flower of the field. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of God will stand forever. And this is how it's understood by both those who translated the Septuagint and by Jerome when he translated the Vulgate. The only problem with this happy picture is that this is the only occurrence of this combination, this word combination in the Tanakh. It just doesn't occur anyplace else. Now, that does not mean that it's impossible or that it's wrong, but it does get our attention and it makes us wonder about it. So many more recent commentators and translators think that this is actually a different word, spelled the same way. The word kain, that refers to some kind of small, irritating insect, a gnat, or a mosquito, or maybe even a louse. By the way, this is the word that's used in the book of Exodus in chapter 8 for the plague of gnats, or the plague of lice that comes upon the Egyptians. Now, this is not, properly speaking, a textual variant, since it does not require changing the text in any way. But it is a different understanding of the text. And we see this different understanding reflected in some modern translations. So while the ESV translates this the way the Septuagint and the Vulgate understand it, and they who dwell in it will die in like manner, but the NIV and the New American Bible translate this, and its inhabitants will die like flies. Moreover, the New Evangelical Translation, the Net Bible, reads, its inhabitants will die like gnats. The New Jerusalem Bible reads, its inhabitants die like vermin. A translation like these also works in the metaphor of Isaiah, because they're going to die like the heaven and earth will pass away. But I'm not sure that gnats or lice are particularly notable for being transient. They're certainly not used in a metaphor with that meaning elsewhere in the Tanakh. So understanding this word combination that way solves the problem of this unique combination of words, and it fits the poetry But the metaphor is not quite as clean since insects are not previously mentioned anywhere in this passage. And as I said, they're not used in this kind of metaphor elsewhere. So I'm not sure that personally I buy this recent translational trend. Well, either way, the temporary nature of the sky and the earth and its inhabitants is contrasted with the teaching and the work of God. So the verse ends, Vishuathi olam tihyeh v'tzidkathi lo techath. My salvation will be forever, and my tzedek, my righteousness, will not techath. Now, this last verb, techath, appears to be a nifal from the geminate root chet tau tau, to be shattered or be disheartened. And here we might think of this not so much in the psychological sense of being shattered, but in the physical sense of being broken. But this seems to be a little bit of a clumsy choice of words here. And some have noted that the Septuagint translates this with a form of the Greek verb eklepo, that means to cease or to come to an end. And that certainly fits the metaphor as well. The Vulgate, by the way, reads this with the Latin deficio, which can also mean to fail or to cease. Because of this, it may be that the Masoretes have mispointed this word, and we should not take it as a nifal of the root chet tau tau, chatath, but instead take it from the root nun chet tau, nachath, meaning to go down, but which also may have the sense of departing or going away. Well, all these options will work in the metaphor that we have here. The point of the metaphor is clear. The permanence of what God has done for his people in delivering them and giving them his teaching stand in stark contrast to the transient nature of the sky or the earth or human life and perhaps even the gnat. In verses 1 to 3, the prophet delivered God's message that the people should pay attention to the way that God kept his promises in the past and take heart and comfort from his promises to us because God will not fail to keep them as well. Here in verses 4 to 6, the comfort that God extends to his people is expressed in terms of the permanence of what God does, compared with the transience of all that we see around us, and indeed of even our own lives. I mentioned how this is thematically similar to Isaiah chapter 40, verses 6 to 8. Remember, this whole section with its repeated calls to pay attention to what God has done and is doing follows directly upon the third servant song in chapter 50. So it would be really easy to preach the gospel from these texts, with a focus on either part or on both parts together, emphasizing the certainty and the permanence of God's promises to his people, fulfilled in the person and the work of God's Messiah and suffering servant, Jesus Christ. Thank you for joining me for this two-part walkthrough of Isaiah 51, verses 1 to 6. I hope you'll join me again when we'll read together another section of God's Word to Israel and to us. Until then, Shalom.